I'm Mark Lanier. I want to welcome everybody who's here or everybody who's watching on the internet. We are really in for a treat today. We've got an amazing panel with amazing people who are going to discuss amazingly important subjects. And they're not doing it off the cuff. They're doing it as part of who they are and their studies over their lifetime and their lifetime experiences. So it's going to be a marvelous well from which we get to drink. And I'm excited that you're all here in the room and joining us online. And so thank you for being here. I want to start by introducing the panel so that you've got an idea of who it is you're going to be listening to. This is Jonathan Walton. Now, Jonathan has his BFA, Bachelor of Fine Arts, in graphic art from Wheaton. And sometime he does these graphic art pictures. I saw his one of Ezekiel and the wheel within a wheel. And I saw his one of Elijah going up in the fiery chariot. And it's pretty incredible. Now, he won't show it to me. His proud father did. So you want to see it. But aside from being an incredible artist, he has a Master's of Arts in Theology from Wheaton and is currently finishing his Ph.D. work at St. Andrews University over in the motherland, England, over the UK, Scotland, wherever it is, the other side of the river. His dissertation is on knowing good and evil, values and presentation in Genesis 2 through 4. He's also co-written some books with his father, and I'm delighted. Would you join me in giving him a Texas welcome? And then our keynote for the weekend is Dr. Ingrid Faro. Now, she has also been on a panel before. She'll be giving the public lecture tomorrow night. She's a visiting professor of Old Testament at Northern Seminary. She's an associate professor of Old Testament at Skandinavisk Teologisk Högskolan in Lubbock, Texas. No, I'm sorry. That's in Uppsala, Sweden. My mistake. Typo. And has been a visiting professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. She actually has a master's in nutrition, as well as a master's of divinity and a Ph.D. in theological studies with a concentration in Old Testament and Semitic languages. And so she is a scholar par excellence, but she's also just an engaging, incredible person. And I do hope you'll get to meet her. I'll be interviewing her in my Sunday school class Sunday morning. So if you want more of Ingrid than you get here and tomorrow night, come and we'll do that. Seated next to her is one of my favorite Old Testament writers. His name is Dr. John Walton. He's been at Wheaton forever and a day. He is set to retire in the spring, has written dozens of books. If you know me well, there are two of his books that I buy in volumes. I mean, I buy by the dozen and give them away like candy. So if you've been to the library to trick or treat, we frequently, that's what you've gotten. And it's The Lost World of Genesis, and it's the brown cover that I can never remember the full title of.
Me neither. Now, Ancient News from Thought in the Old Testament.
Yes, he will put Genesis, the origin stories and some of the stories of Genesis, he will put them into their cultural context, which is critical for us if we're going to understand them today, because our tendency is going to always be to read it in our context. But we're delighted and honored to have John here. Hope is to have him back at some point in the future as a keynote lecturer. So you grace us with your presence. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. And he's like dad to him. And seated next to him is Catherine McDowell. She's an associate professor of Old Testament at Gordon Conwell. Now, you may be saying, why all this Old Testament stuff? Because the problem of evil is one that is deeply entrenched in the Old Testament. and it's given into that Jewish angst of today because, as my friend Rick Meadow would say, most every Jewish holiday is they tried to kill us, they weren't successful, let's eat. And so the Old Testament studies are studies that give birth more readily to these issues than a lot of other studies. And so we've got Catherine with us, part-time professor of Hebrew and Old Testament at Lanier Theological Library in Haiti. And she has her bachelor's degree from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is a Tar Heel fan. The only team she likes better than them are the Texas Tech Red Raiders. And she doesn't realize that, but it's true. And she has her master's from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and her master's and Ph.D. from Harvard, the Texas Tech of Massachusetts. And the publications she's got are exhaustive as well. And so would you join me? Well, actually, I can't. Let's keep going. Let's get David in here. David's a professor of philosophy down the street. His PhD's from Wayne State, but he's the director of the Center for Moral Apologetics at Houston Christian University. That's a big issue because there are a lot of people who do not believe that there is an all-powerful God in light of the evil that is clear in this world. And so it is at the root of moral apologetics in so many different ways. And we are delighted to have David here. He's been here before, but I think this is his first time on a panel. So would you join me in welcoming all of these people? Now, my job is to moderate this panel, and I'm feeling fairly moderate myself, so I think it will work. But I do need to warn you that this chapel is a replica of a 6th century Byzantine chapel, which means there are no restrooms. But if you go right outside, there are restrooms there, and obviously the library has restrooms as well. We're going to be here for about an hour and 22 minutes. That's the hope. So with that, let us commence. Why don't we start with some definitions? And I want to talk about what is good, tov in the Hebrew. What is bad, evil, ra in the Hebrew. It's typically the word translated that way. So what is good and what is evil so that we know where you're coming from? And we are in Texas. My mother is seated right there, which means she expects me to behave. So we go ladies first. Ingrid or Catherine, either one, when you're using the terms good and evil, what do you mean by that?
You want to start, Ingrid? You've written the book on it. Yep.
In my dissertation, that was one of the questions that I was asking, and that was from the Hebrew of Genesis. And so I can take it from that good has a wide range of usages, but essentially, first of all, God is considered good. It doesn't explicitly say that, but we see goodness expressed in creation and the sevenfold repetition for emphasis. And so good, I see, means flourishing, blessing, abundance, things that are giving toward life. That would be my simplest definition of good. Should I go on to evil, or should we pass?
Sure.
Okay.
When you speak of evil, what do you mean?
By evil, my simple definition that I'll use tomorrow night as well is the corruption of creational and relational goodness. So it's, I do not see evil as the absence of good, but as taking what was good and was intended to be good and twisting it, polluting it, corrupting it, defiling it.
Taking a good cell and turning it cancerous.
Essentially.
Okay. Catherine, how would you modify that, or how would you add to it? What is it? How do you put it in your words?
Yeah, in addition to what Ingrid shared with us, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on God being good, because he doesn't commit evil acts. Therefore, the things that he does are good. Not only the things that are explicitly affirmed as good, such as creation, but even his commands are good. Even his limitations are good. We may not always understand the good that is in them or the good they will bring about, but because of who he is, anything he utters is actually ultimately good.
Okay. David, when you use those terms, what do you mean? What do you have to add or modify or put into your words?
Yeah, well, all right. So I'm a philosopher, and it's a little intimidating to be up here with all these Old Testament folks and all. So yeah, the way I'm approaching it, I suppose, a little different as a philosopher. So yeah, I think of good as primordial, and like what was suggested, I think of badness or evil as a distortion, perversion. I suppose in some cases a privation, but I agree it's not just the absence, it's sort of a distorted version of the good. That's where evil comes in. And by the way, when we use the term evil nowadays, I mean, historically, I think that that's a term that was understood to be a rather thick moral concept, right? Not just a thin one. It's really thick. There's some ontology, there's some heft, there's some, oomph to it. But I think that we live in increasingly deflationary times where evil gets spoken of just in terms of garden variety and badness, and in ways that are more amenable to sort of secular appraisals and understandings of what it's about. Whereas, Christians historically have thought that evil is a real thing. I mean, it's a perversion of the good, but it is its own thing, and it's a real thing that needs to be acknowledged, needs to be addressed, and that sort of thing. Now, if the good is primordial and evil just comes about as a result of the perversion of it, we should probably talk, more about what that is. Again, historically, Christians have connected ultimate goodness with God. This has been done in a variety of ways. The way I'm sort of most drawn to do it is sort of in the Neoplatonic way of thinking of God as the good. So you have the is of predication. God happens to instantiate the property of goodness. That's true. But God is also the good, right, ultimately. And that's the way I'm inclined to see this. And I like the way Robert Adams puts this. He says, God is ineffable, right? We can't fully get our minds around him. And if the good is identical to God, it makes the ultimate good somewhat ineffable too. We kind of have intimations of what it's about and such, but we sort of see through a glass darkly. We only catch these furtive sort of glances as to what the ultimate good is. So I think of sort of as a theistic Platonist or some such, I think of God as the ultimate good. I think of other things that are good in this world as in some sense partaking of God or resembling God. Or there's some sort of dependence relation there. But God's the ultimate good, and that's why something like friendship is also a good thing, because it resembles in a relevant sense some significant feature of God's nature, God's character, things like that. But that's sort of how I think about the good and the evil.
Okay, we're going young Walton first. Jonathan?
So for my research, I was describing the good primarily in terms of values, which is the things that are good are the things that people think are valuable, which is the things that people want. I argued that this is going to change to some degree based on who the people are who are doing the valuing and doing the wanting, that it tends to come from culture. And so for that reason, the values and the ideas of goodness that we see in the Hebrew Bible from the culture that produced this literature are going to be somewhat different than what our personal ones might be today, or what even mine are personally reading and writing about it. So what they think in the Hebrew Bible that goodness consists of is primarily something we might call order. It's
something what?
Something that we might call order. It's things being where they are and doing as they should, what they were designed to do, filling their purpose. And this conception takes place primarily in the realm of human activity and human experience. So it's about people doing what they should in the places where they ought to be doing them. when they talk about God being good, they mostly talk about God interacting with this realm of human value and human experience. So God is good when God helps give them the things that they value and gives them the things that they want. Evil, kind of the absence of that, comes in two distinct forms that are different from each other. You have the world outside of creation, where the ordered system has not yet been established and does not yet exist. It's defined by absence and negation and otherness and emptiness. You have another sense of badness, of evil, that occurs within the system, where things are doing what they aren't supposed to do. They are corrupting and undermining and damaging. And these two concepts of badness or undesirable it's important to keep them separate from each other. And it's also important when we're reading the Bible to understand that they're describing what these cultures thought they consisted of. It's not necessarily the things that we would.
Okay. This is going to make for rich discussion. Thank you for giving us your perspective and how you use those words, because you've definitely got a different shade than what we've been hearing thus far. So, John, as the senior man on the panel, give us your thoughts on this. What do you mean when you use those words?
I'm not much of a philosopher, an ethicist, theologian. I'm a text guy. I do exegesis. I work in the Hebrew text and the ancient world that was its context. And so when I address a question like this, even though all of those other things will eventually flow into the conversation, what I have to contribute is on that first step. And in that point, it's really not a very productive direction for us to work with English words. Sorry, but good and evil as English words already drum up all kinds of ideas that are in all of those other realms and serve important roles in those. But I have to start by asking about tov, good, and ra, evil. And of course, Ingrid did her work, and one of her whole chapters opened up those semantic questions, and Jonathan has done his work in the systems and the structures in which these terms operate. And I'm pretty much in line with the work that Jonathan's done. I've done some of the same kind of work. Our research overlaps in that regard, that good pertains primarily to the highest value system that they have in the ancient world, which is an order value system, not necessarily a moral value system. And therefore, when they talked about good, they're talking about that, as Jonathan said, that desirable shape of things, that they're working the way they ought to work, and that it is ordered and it is operating properly. Now, moral behavior can fit into that, but it doesn't define the category. And likewise, when we talk about evil, ra, we find that a simple moral definition doesn't work very well in the Bible, because God can do ra. And therefore, calling it evil is not necessarily going to be capturing all we need to capture. So that ra, what we often define as evil, is that which is counteracting order, working against it. And so, as Jonathan mentioned, the things that are undesirable, that are disruptive, that things don't go the way they are supposed to go. And so I start out with that level of conversation, the ancient world, the Hebrew text, the ways that they use words and concepts, and the ways that they put those into their conversations. So that's what I would start with.
Okay, and so within the framework of that, I'm pulling up passages as we're talking. I'll hang on to that for a moment. Within the framework of that, how do you, and so I'm going to stick with John and Jonathan, how do you make a transition that's useful in this world between your understanding of what good and evil was in the Old Testament text and how it's relevant to us who are charged to do good and to abstain from evil. How do you make that transition from that contextual concept of good and evil?
You should go first.
Okay. Transitions are tricky things because we're taking a conversation in one culture at one time with a certain call it cognitive environment, cultural context, and then we're trying to extrapolate those ideas into other contexts. So eventually we have to make a transition from talking about Hebrew texts and Israelite thinking to the larger issues of theology and morality, and that's an important exercise, and it's one I'm happy to let others do for the most part. But certainly the idea that we have seen morality as a centerpiece as we talk about values, and therefore, of course, they would flow out of concepts of order or disruption of order as we talk about them. Some of that comes in transition from what Jonathan's already described as sort of a tripartite system, order, and then the two forms of missing order. But then we have to move to what is more recently, Hellenistic period perhaps, a dualistic system. He can express that better than I can.
I can, but it's not how I would go about answering the question. I would say that I don't actually think that the biblical text and the narrative content that it contains actually tells us much about how we should go about conceiving of goodness or about being good. I think it didn't actually tell its original audience much either about how they should go about conceiving of goodness or how they should go about being good, because it mostly, when we see the way that it describes things that are good or even tells them things that they should do, is always in terms of things that they would have already known, in terms of images, ideas, symbols that are meaningful to them. When we compare the depictions that it gives of people behaving well or people behaving badly or people being rewarded or punished for certain behaviors, and whether or not the rewards and punishments were appropriate and are something that should be celebrated or mourned, they're very consistent with what we see in most other literature from similar time periods. So if we come at the question of how does the Bible telling us how to be good, we're asking the wrong question. We have to figure it out the same way that they did, and they didn't even have the Bible when they did it. They had to learn based on what their culture's values were, and the Bible, when it communicates whatever message it has, is operating within the assumptions that their culture makes.
Okay, so I want to expand this beyond you two, and I don't want to just center it on this dialogue, but the lawyer in me would say, wait a minute, you've got passages like Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? To do good, love justice, walk humbly with your God. You've got the passages that tell us to do good and avoid evil. Good in the Micah passage, I believe, is tov. It's the same word, and it's clearly some instruction. And if Micah's written at a time to a people whose culture told them the good was injustice, the good was the rich get rich and the poor get poorer, the courts exist for the powerful who can listen to the elders in the gates, and the gates elders will listen to them and vote their way regardless of what's there, keep the tunic of the person. I'm wondering about that, and I don't want to rob you two of responding, but I want to throw that on the table while we talk to Ingrid. We'll let you go next. The other passage that's in my brain through this is the Mark passage where Jesus says, call no man good. Now he's Greek, so we've got agathos instead, but call no man good, for God alone is good. An attribute that ascribes good to God, agathos, which is beauty as well. But Ingrid, why don't you join into this dialogue?
Yeah, the very interesting thing about what each of my colleagues here have said in describing good, they describe good as what people value, what they want and what they value. And that is very much, therefore, a human perspective. So describing, and certainly the Bible talks a lot about what is the human perspective on what is good or bad. And interestingly, also in my research, in looking at all of the words associated with the word evil, and again, my focus was on Genesis, but then I'm continuing to take it through the Old and the New. The word grouping that is most commonly associated with the word evil is not the word good. The most common word grouping has to do with words having to do with sight, perspective. How do you see things? So we see in Genesis the sevenfold, and He made, He spoke, He made, and God saw that was good. The next time we see that exact same sentence structure is in Genesis chapter 3, after the serpent comes and tells the woman, no, that one tree that God said you should avoid, that's the one tree that you really want. And then she looked and she saw that that tree then was good to make her wise. And so the way God saw things and the way she saw things became completely controverted. The next place we see that same sentence structure is in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of Adam, and the word in Hebrew is tov. So they're looking, and there was not supposed to be a crossing of those realms, and that's again my interpretation of that, but they're looking and they're seeing things differently than God. And so the definition from a biblical perspective, and again, evil has a wide range of meaning. We can't compare it. In English, we tend to think evil, but it has a wide range. So evil, as I've come to see, is what was God's intent in creation and in covenant. And so what is God's perspective? So God's perspective of what is good is what is good, because we see then through the rest of Scripture where at the end of the book of Judges, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We see that decline. Everybody is doing, well, this looks good to me. This is what I value. This is what I want. I'm going to take. I will take what I want because this is what I value. And then every single king of Judah, I think there's a couple exceptions, is judged based on, did they do what was right? It doesn't even say good, right in the eyes of God, or what was evil in the eyes of God. And so that assessment is what is God's perspective versus what is our perspective. And that, for me, becomes what defines evil.
And I can agree with that entirely. Am I on this now?
Yeah. Let's make sure he's mic'd. We need to hear him.
Yeah.
All right, try that one.
Okay. Hello.
Is that good? Can you hear?
Yeah.
So I think that's insightful. It gets us going the right direction, but still in that sense, I would say, so God is the source and center of order. I mean, that's what he is. And therefore, proper order drives from him. And what happened with Adam and Eve in chapter 3 was that the tree that would offer them the ability to find order on their own terms, in their own paths, for their own sakes, was set before them, and they took it. And from that point on, you've got this divergence in which God's desire for order was not being fulfilled as people instead tried to pursue their own idea of what would bring order. And their sense of order was very selfish, as we all tend to do. What's going to be order for me? And so in that sense, yes, there is a sense of tov that they had, right? But it was focused on the wrong thing. And so as a result, it was actually disruptive of God's tov, of God's order bringing. So that's how I would put those pieces together. We're talking about, sounds like some of the same things.
All right, Catherine, weigh in here. You've been making notes. I've been watching you.
Again, I think we're probably talking about similar things in different terms, but I don't think I have to say, I don't fully align with the Waltons. I do think there has to be something outside of the people themselves by which good is defined. And that has to be God. I don't think it can be limited to what people value. I mean, I understand what you guys are saying, and maybe we're just talking about two sides of the same coin. But as you pointed out, John, that what people value quickly becomes distorted very quickly, right? Genesis 3, and then the rest of the Bible is all about unpacking that. So that's one point I wanted to make, was that I think there has to be some external standard. Good in Scripture can't simply be how authors defined it, or how an Israelite or a Hebrew would have defined it. And I do think there's a significant moral component to this. But the term that comes to mind isn't tov as much as tzedakah, righteousness. There is some overlap there. But you're right, Mark, that often, or there are cases where the term good is used. But as Ingrid pointed out, the semantic range for some of these terms is quite large. So I would tend to think of it more in terms of good, in terms of righteousness and holiness and things that are opposed to God. And, I think when Eve and Adam were told, or when Eve was told, you eat this fruit and you'll become like God, knowing good and evil, the temptation there to be like God, I think is perhaps, I'm still thinking about this, so don't quote me on this, but this attempt to grab divinity or to be God is something that underlies all evil, or that is in some way connected to evil in a very significant way.
I think though, in a way, what you're saying is also another side of the Walton coin, if I could. Yeah. And John or Jonathan, correct me, but I mean, to some degree, justice as a concept is order.
Right.
And you hear the term order in the court. Yeah. Order is inherent in justice. And if we're going to have a just court, you've got to have order in the court. And God's order and God's justice has often been usurped by a human desire for their order, which typically is injustice, as at the trials in Hosea and Micah and those minor prophets.
So God created people to be his image. You did your dissertation on this. Created them his image to be order bringers alongside of him, subdue and rule. And so when they took from the tree, you could say they're deciding to freelance, to go out on their own. And therefore they are order bringers, but order focused on themselves instead of God as the center and source of order. So in that sense, certainly the idea that God defines what order should be, and that they deviated from that. I'm
just not comfortable with it using the word only order for that. I know you guys are saying that's from their cognitive environment. But
it's got a broader semantic range.
But I want to stick with the biblical terms for that. I'm a text person too. I'm not a philosopher, professional theologian either. And I did not work professionally in good and evil in Genesis. But I think at least it's helpful to start with how the Bible associates those.
I think these are good discussion points, and I want to make sure everybody understands what y'all mean when you use the terms. And so we've got some nuanced differences because we're going to progress through this dialogue. I think, and I'm about to turn philosophical, so David, you're getting this next pitch. I think within the framework of this, as a lawyer who's reading the text, I see the disorder slightly different from y'all on what happened when Adam and Eve chose to eat of the fruit. In legal terms, they stole that fruit. They stole from God's tree. God owned that tree, and he didn't and he said, don't touch my tree. Don't touch it. That's Satan. He said, don't eat my fruit. And they stole it from him. And there is inherent disorder in that disobedience because now they are the authority and they're setting their own authority. I think these are great terms. But we want to swing for the fences here. These people paid a lot of money to be in here, and they need to get their money's worth. So here's my question, and this is rooted in philosophy, but it's found in text. I would suggest that even though we say God does not do evil, although it does, I think it's Isaiah who says he does Ra. Isn't it in Isaiah? I think it's Isaiah where it says it. But evil in the sense that we're talking, although this is part of my interpretation of the Isaiah passage. I would suggest to you that sometimes our God chooses the lesser of two evils and teaches us to do the same. So philosophize. Yeah. David Baggett, is it fair to say that God will at times choose the lesser of two evils and teach us to do the same?
Yes, I think that's right. And I do want to say a few things in response to what was said. It's relevant.
Fair.
So, if we talk about the good in terms of fulfilling a function or something like that, and we do use language in that way, like a good car is one that gets you to where you want to go. That's a Thomistic principle, right?
Explain what you mean by a Thomistic principle.
So Thomistic philosophy, Aristotle, Aquinas, a notion of good according to which something is good insofar as it does what it was intended to do. I want to make a point. I know I'm not an Old Testament person, I'm a philosopher, but I really think that we need to work really hard to forge connections between the philosophy and the Bible stuff. Instead of, well, we're going to do it Bible, we're not going to do it this other way. If you're talking about goodness, at least partially in terms of fulfilling a function, philosophers talk in those terms too. That's a thoroughgoing Thomistic notion. That's a great deal of overlap between these two discussions. There doesn't have to be a disconnect here. We can actually advance the discussion, it seems to me, by incorporating elements of special revelation and general revelation. We really believe in general revelation too, right? Well, using reason, using our minds, and so forth. So, this whole text, non-text. Anyway, I'm being grumpy about that. But on the issue of the valuing, there's an ambiguity, right? Good is what people value. Wait a minute. No. Look, valuing descriptively or prescriptively, right? Some people value horrible things. That doesn't make them valuable. It makes them able to be valued, but it doesn't make them objectively, intrinsically valuable, right? So that's we just need some clarity on that. And it seems to me that it's already implicit when there's this talk about bringing about objective order and such like that. So clearly it's not just a free-for-all, up for grabs, whatever people happen to value. There's something objective about that story. And that overlaps with what philosophers and with what ethicists talk about all the time. There's great opportunities for forging integration and synthesis here instead of some kind of artificial disconnect. Last thing, most relevant to your question, no, God cannot do evil. Now look, here's the thing. When we talk about evil, we're talking about something like, say, sin. God can't sin. Now, can God do things that are in some sense bad? Sure, because sometimes in a broken world, there are going to be circumstances in which, God's going to have to do something. Neither option is particularly good. And being a maximally good, loving God, he's going to probably choose the lesser, say, of the two evils, like Lanier was suggesting here. I think that's absolutely right. But we've got to disambiguate, right, between badness and evil. Kant did this. This isn't new, right? It's just a garden variety distinction in philosophy. We make it all the time, but it's relevant to this discussion. To say God can do evil without qualifying what you're saying carries with it, I think, a highly objectionable implication and one in diametric variance with scriptural teaching. So let's get some clarity on that, it seems to me.
Okay, and I don't know that anybody would fuss with your conclusions, But we still struggle with these passages that John knows as a Hebrew scholar that specifically says that God does ra, which is the word we typically translate evil, but it's got a broad semantic range. Ingrid, you're dying to say something. Go.
Yeah, because it is Isaiah 45, where God is speaking with Cyrus and so forth. And the last line is that he does good and creates evil. So so that's always, of course, the big hardship and so much the problem. But I have a response to that in studying the goodness of God also needs to include a study of God's justice. And God is merciful and God is just. You can have justice without mercy. You can't have mercy without justice. So God had to create a system of justice. So I go by as I read scripture, that everything, who God is and everything that he does is good. And everything that he set up is good. And when humans and the cosmos is running according to his order, there will be shalom. There will be right and righteousness. So but God knowingly making creatures that could choose against him, which is what he did, because we're obviously not puppets. There had to be a system of justice. And so therefore, if goodness is corrupted, God creates, from what I see and other scholars and so forth that I quote, is there's a lexical precision to the justice of God in the Hebrew. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs describes chiasms as having mirror imagery, and even in the mirror imagery of the chiasm, the Hebrew structures itself, there's a built-in system of justice. So if you do this, that leads to this. So you break God's goodness. Here's God's goodness. It's nope, not going to do it that way. So therefore, you do this, and it will lead to this, and therefore the consequences will come out here. So a lexical and a literary precision to the justice of God. I've traced that through some pericopes, through some passages in the Hebrew Bible, and I continue to find more, but we also hear it in the words of the prophets. We hear it, for example, Psalm 7, if the ditch that you dug, you will fall into. There's all of these action consequences that if you do this, this is what will happen. And the more I study it, the more I see it throughout Scripture. So in saying God created evil, God made good, but in order for people to learn what goodness is, the violation of it has to have very specific consequences. And I see very specific consequences built into the Hebrew scriptures.
So my approach to this has always been an inherent understanding that part of the definition of God is life in its fullest, best sense. And so when we follow God's order, which includes God's morality, we will find life. When we distort or pervert God's order, which includes God's morality, we will find death. Life is in God, death is outside of God. And so those choices do have those consequences. But I brought it to David to discuss the lesser of two evils, thinking about biblical passages on good and evil and order and disorder. For example, when Jesus is approached by students of the law, teachers of the law, who ask him, what is a legitimate reason for divorcing your wife? And Jesus's appeal back is to the order of God's creation. And then they said, well, wait a minute, but God also told Moses you can do a certificate of divorce. Why did God put that out there if that's not the order or best good of God? And his answer was, because of the hardness of your hearts. God's making the best of a bad situation. That's better than the husband beating the wife up to a pulp, or the wife, taking it out on the husband in whatever way. At some point in time, God said, I'm going to put into the law the lesser of two evils for a choice at this point. But it's not God doing the evil per se, but it is God trying to bring order to the disorder, even inherent within that. Is that?
So when God does Ra, what he's doing is disrupting order, but not disrupting his own order. He's disrupting the order that people have been trying to do the wrong way for the wrong reasons. And whether it's a massive flood or whether it's some of that legislation that you're talking about, God is disrupting Isaiah 45. God is disrupting what people have come to think is order because it benefits them. So we still have this distinction between those issues. And by the way, David, I don't think they're disconnects at all. I mean, I wouldn't describe it that way. It's just I don't want to speak outside my competency. So I'm trying to focus on the things that I can
You're
address.
staying in your lane, but your lane is all part of this big highway.
Right, epistemic trespassing. I don't.
That's fair. I want to ask one last question on this, and then I want to transition to my Rick Meadow question. My question to you is this, Jonathan. I did see some brilliant illustrations that you did for your dad. If you had to illustrate the concept of good and the concept of evil, and we were going to get a picture worthy of a chapel ceiling, how would you illustrate them? Draw on your MFA or your BFA as well as your knowledge, biblical knowledge. How would you illustrate them?
Oh, I think that you would want to demonstrate it in a way that would be meaningful to the people who are looking at it. So I would think about the people who would come here and what images they would see that they would find indicative of a sense of goodness that they would find uplifting, healing, nurturing or calming, and likewise a depiction of evil that they would find disturbing or frightening or in whatever way. And what symbols you would choose to represent that would depend largely on the specific people that you thought were there and what kinds of things they would see. So we tend to, in our culture, associate, for example, evil with darkness and with pain and with fear, and goodness with kind of light and warmth and happiness and peace. But I think what would be the most appropriate way to depict is how they relate to each other. And when you're approaching this question, the question starts to look differently when you're thinking about which one is winning. So do you depict good and evil in harmony, working together, like you see in Taoism or something? Would you show them like as just a white and a black mirror of each other, kind of interacting into a harmony? Would you show it as a conflict? And if you did show it as a conflict, would it be the idea of like evil kind of consuming and devouring a small island of goodness in the middle of nowhere? Or would it be the other way around? Would you have like the Michael and the Dragon things where goodness is resplendent and triumphant and evil is kind of diminishing and collapsing and falling away? And I'm not sure which one of those I would choose. I know personally the view that I'm inclined to see, but I would feel very reluctant to try to answer that question and show it to someone else without knowing what they were coming from, because these images can be very, very distorting depending on what somebody's experience is of evil when they come to ask this question. Because when somebody comes in and their understanding of the world is that it's just being swallowed in darkness, And then they come in and they see a picture of good and evil fitting side by side and holding hands. It's frightening and alienating. When they see a picture of good triumphing over evil, it can be nonsensical. So like how can that possibly be a representation of the world? It's absurd. On the other hand, it could provide a sense of hope if they see the world drowning in darkness and they wish it wasn't that way and they don't know any other way to see the world. Then when you show a different image, then that can itself provide hope. So this is just a lot of different ways to go about it, and I would kind of feel sorry for whoever's responsibility it was to paint that picture.
Fair.
It's called apocalyptic.
Yes. Yeah, in a very real sense, it's what we see in the apps painted up here as you, and I invite everybody to look at it. But we can talk about an artistic portrayal of good and evil, but we can also talk about historical examples and portrayals of good and evil. I didn't know my brother Rick was going to be here today. Rick is Jewish, and he and I have been dear friends for decades, 20 years or so. And Rick came today because he's been watching a special on the Holocaust. And he's trying to understand that in light of a good, all-powerful, and loving God. I got a text from Michael Card, about a year or so ago. And he was in Israel. And he said, Mark, can you text me the library address? I want to send a book to the library. It needs to be in your library. And I texted him the address. I said, but you got me curious. What's the book? He says, I found a book here in Israel that's got listed every Jew that died in the Holocaust. I said, wow. And you'll see it when you go in the library. It's front and center on a dais. But the book is about almost 5 inches thick. It's probably 10 by 12 in size. And when you open it up, in multiple columns, in 4-point font, is the word Jew, written 8 million times. And you see the size of that book, and you wonder about those questions. How can God be there when that kind of evil was allowed to happen? So who wants to start our dialogue? I just set it up.
Yeah.
Ingrid?
Yeah, I will. My mother did refugee work in Poland right at the end of the war. For 4 years, she was there helping feed and care for people coming out of the ghettos and the concentration camps. So I grew up with pictures, images, and conversations about it. So it's been part of my life. And one of the best books that I read was by a Rabbi Yitzhak Kerzner, called Making Sense of Suffering, A Jewish Approach. At the back, he has an appendix about the Holocaust. Almost all of his family was wiped out in the Holocaust as well. And so it's certainly something that I've wrestled with, as well as people who even today, since in our life, more of our lifetime, the genocides and so forth that are taking place. And but specifically for the Holocaust, and by no means do I have any simple answers, but to add a few layers to it to begin the conversation. And one of my greatest angers is when I look at and read about nations, France, even Poland and so forth, that went ahead and before Germany had entered, they were told the Jewish people don't belong, and they started putting them in separate places, in arenas, in separate cities and so forth. They started shunning them. And just the complicity of humanity before Germany ever entered their countries or started taking any Jewish people out. People were complicit in shunning them and putting them in, separating them from other humanity. The role of humanity, we read all over pastors and so forth that cooperated with making the destruction and the death of so many Jewish people possible. So we have to, the first place that I need to look is, where were we? Where were the people? The number of people at Yad Vashem who are considered the righteous Gentiles, why is it, what, like maybe 5% of the population of Europe? I mean, no, 0.001, I forget now, but it was some percentage but just almost nobody. How many people stood up to protect other people? And why? Why? Why are we so quick to make others other? Why do we see videos today of people being beaten and videos where nobody's stepping up? They're taking videos, for heaven's sakes. So the question is throughout history, and certainly the Holocaust is just the massive, put it in our face at our complicity with refusing to treat our fellow human being as all created in the image of God. And Abraham Heschel, and he managed to live because he came to the U.S. That's who Martin Luther King and Cornel West, the people in the civil rights, they were reading Abraham Heschel. And he says, and I can't quote him, but he has so many important, he said, to us, a small act of injustice, people are expendable. We talk about people's values. People are expendable, but to the prophets, it's a disaster. To us, a little life, way overlooked. Oh, I can't help you. To God, it's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. It's the end of the world. To the prophets who are hearing God's voice, every act of injustice, every human being that is overlooked, every poor person who is stepped on, to God, it is a disaster. And if we saw that, if we had God's heart for other human beings, and again, going back to Kathy McDowell's book on the image of God in the Garden of Eden, every human being, which makes the scripture, Genesis 1 and 2, completely different than all the other ancient Near Eastern literature. Every human being is created in the image of God, not just the kings or the gods, every one of us. And so that, to me, is the core of where the Holocaust went wrong, of how it could even be possible. It's the core of how every atrocity is possible. When we start to marginalize and commodify people for our protection or to make us comfortable.
Okay, you've done good at, if I set the table, you have added a lot of food to it. But I want everyone else to chime in, because I want to know, okay, we clearly didn't do what we should have done, but where was God? Mm-hmm. Who's ready? John, you held up the mic.
When we chose to pursue our own path of order, God chose to let us.
Yes.
And certainly there are times where he does adjustments or where he responds, but basically it was, this is what you chose, how's it going? Mm-hmm. And the fact is, our own pursuit of order for ourselves leads to a lot of bad decisions, whether it's group order, groupthink, or whether it's individuals protecting their own interests. I don't want to say every, but nearly every act of war that we know of historically is substantiated by the rhetoric of bringing order. That somehow the conqueror has to bring order, and so they're going against someone else. And when people responded to Germany, they were seeking to protect order for themselves at the cost of others. And sometimes that means shunning those that are somehow other. It means making decisions that are very selfishly oriented, not toward the good that would be God's order, but to the good that would be my order, and how I can prosper and survive, and things of that sort. So to say, where was God? God was in the very same place as he was in the Garden of Eden, when he said, you chose this. And sometimes you let people hit the bottom. You let people that you interact with and in relationships, they make bad choices. And so in that sense, I don't feel like this is a blot on God's record. We chose this.
Okay. Nick Bostrom hit it big in the public eyes in the early 200s when he suggested, he published a peer-reviewed paper that suggested there is a significant likelihood that we don't really exist beyond the fact that we're all part of the algorithms in a computer simulation. That if humanity lives long enough, they will become proficient enough to develop computer programs that have algorithms that are self-thinking. And that either humanity destroys itself or humanity lives that long. If humanity lives that long, who's to say that we're not just part of that computer algorithm that's running at some point in the future, thinking that we are? But the Bible story is very different. The Bible story is that we're not computer programmed by God or a future race. We really are people, and we really do make choices. And if God's not going to make us a computer program or a puppet, then our choices really do have consequences. And so, John, the choice that you're talking about is one that's a human choice, and it's not that God is not there. God is begging and pleading with us to make a difference. If God will weep over the death of Lazarus, one Jewish fellow, how many tears were shed over the decisions and the choices as God begged and pleaded for his people to do something about the Holocaust. And to the credit of the greatest generation, there are a lot of people who laid their life down to fight Hitler and all that was. So I don't want to leave that aside as well. But who else wants to comment on where is God as we watch these videos on the Holocaust?
I hesitate to respond to this question, but I feel like I have to because here I am, right? I'm sitting up here, that's what I'm supposed to do. I would agree with John that it's not God that moved, but it is one of the starkest reminders of the capacity that humanity has for evil. And as you said, God didn't create us as robots. And whether we think of it in terms of disorder or sin, humanity is capable of some of the most egregious things, right? We're aware of this, we know this, but, and as has been mentioned, sometimes God intervenes and pauses things, stops things, mitigates them sometimes. I think that's probably, for me, a helpful way to think of the lesser of two evils is he's actually mitigating evil. He reduces the lifespan after the flood, a way to mitigate human evil. Tower of Babel, he didn't kill everyone, he confused the language and dispersed them as a means to mitigate human evil. But so I don't know if I can answer the question any more than to say that it's not God that moved, but to say that it's instructive to us, I think, in terms of, again, the capacity that we have for evil. And, a lot of these Germans who were complicit were like your next door neighbor, the person down the street. Like, I think we fool ourselves if we think we're not capable of evil of this magnitude. And it's only by the grace of God and through the death and resurrection of Jesus himself that changes us and that moves us from that more into his likeness. So I wish I could say more about it, but I think in terms of Job, and I'm not comparing Job was one man. I'm not equating his experience to the Holocaust, which was millions of people. But one of the places ironically, that I find comfort when I'm thinking about suffering, I do, as you mentioned, I do work in Haiti, and I'm teaching in Haiti now by Zoom, unfortunately, because of the situation. And I'm getting updates, got one yesterday. Starvation, the poverty rate, people facing starvation. The organization I'm working with has been sneaking money in through cereal boxes to try to help people eat. And the things that go on, just an example of human evil and the capacity for it. But I'd find comfort in the God's speeches to Job, at the end of Job. And a lot of people are like, why would you find comfort there? Because God seems a little heavy-handed. But it's a just a very vivid reminder of who God is and who humanity is not, right? Not God. God is God, humanity is not God. And, I wouldn't say to you or to a Holocaust survivor what I'm about to say now, because I think it would be too callous. I'm not talking about the Holocaust, I'm talking about suffering just generally, that there is tremendous comfort in reminding ourselves that God is God and we are not. And that not, this onslaught of rhetorical questions that God poses to Job, knowing that Job can't answer them because he doesn't know the answers, does provide me with a measure of comfort when I think about some of these larger issues of tremendous suffering in human history and the capacity for human evil. So I know that's barely a Band-Aid, but I did want to mention it.
It's wonderful. David, what are your thoughts on this from your chair?
So yeah, I resonate with much of what was said. So I've got a few points. If we punt to something like free will and say, well, look, people have this free will with which to make decisions, and sometimes the decisions are really going to be horrible. If God created a world in which there are meaningfully free agents, presumably he did so for good reasons, and it would mean that he would kind of have good reasons to let this play out and not intervene every time bad choices are going to be made. Of course, in the case of the Holocaust, you might think he'd make an exception, right? We're not entirely sure what he might have done, to actually limit it somewhat. But obviously, great evil was done. So even in a kicking it to free will, it helps, but it leaves some questions still unanswered. It's mysterious. I mean, it is admittedly mysterious, and I think that when we are discussing something like the Holocaust, it does us good to just admit that we don't have all the answers. I love your humility in answering the question. I just think that's so right. So there's that. Then I think something like the Holocaust also illustrates, as was also mentioned by Catherine, how bad we can be as human beings. And earlier I mentioned how evil is a thick moral concept, and I think this is precisely a case where we can see, like, this is really bad. This is evil. I mean, this is beyond the pale evil. And we're capable of that. And I also liked your point about how it was garden variety people who did it. And they weren't preternaturally bad people. They were people like us in particular circumstances who had enough disincentives not to and enough incentives to do this, and it led to that, which is, sobering and horribly sad. But that's the human condition, and that needs addressing. And Christianity, it seems to me, has a solution to that level of depravity. We can explain the depravity. We can also hold out hope for a solution for it. Because of the intense nature of this challenge, too, I think it reminds us, when we talk about the problem of evil, not just to cover the easy cases, like, well, I feel some pain when I go to the gym, but it's good pain because I'm healthier afterwards. Okay, that doesn't even touch it, right? Talk about things that are really hard, like the Holocaust. I mean, acknowledge that it is a real challenge. By the way, I do run the Center for the Foundations of Ethics at Houston Christian, and so much of what we do is we look at the moral evidence of the world and we ask which direction it goes in. And the moral argument is up against the problem of evil. These two are engaged in a zero-sum game. One will lose and one will win. Now, I'm convinced that the moral argument actually wins, and that the problem of evil is not an intractable problem, as challenging as it is. But one or the other will win. Because we're talking about what direction does the moral evidence of this world point to? It's going to be one or the other. It's not both. One last thing. I like that scene in Shadowlands, though, by the way. Remember the scene where the boy's crying and he says, I don't understand why she had to die, his mother. And Jack says, nor me. And then the boy says, I don't believe in heaven. And Jack says, that's okay. Like, he realized that wasn't the moment to have a theological discussion. That was a moment to just hug the kid, and cry with him. And sometimes that's the best we can do. But with respect to the problem of evil, there are 3 versions you might know. There's the logical version, says it's just incoherent to believe in God in this case, but that has largely been defeated. Alvin Plantinga pretty much showed that argument failed. There's a probabilistic version, which is still in the air. The existence of a good and loving God is rendered unlikely in the face of the quality and quantity of evils that we find in this world. And that's the discussion that we're having, and there's a lot of great discussion to be had there. And again, I think the moral argument actually wins at the end of the day, which gives me great hope that there can actually be a solution to these things. And it's not just, that's really sad. There's no hope, That would be bad. But there's a third version, and I actually think that this is often overlooked as a relevant consideration here. The third version of the problem of evil, it's apart from the evidential questions. It's the psychological, it's the existential, it's the pastoral struggle. Because look at C.S. Lewis. He wrote a whole book on the problem of pain. Then he lost his wife, and look at what he went through, right? In, what's the book he wrote? A Grief Observed, right. So in A Grief Observed, you can see his existential struggle with evil. He had good intellectual answers, right? But he still emotionally struggled. So you can have great answers philosophically to address the problem of evil, even in its worst forms, and still fall flat on your face. And so can I, when we encounter actual, real, horrific suffering in our lives. That takes spiritual formation, maturity, strength that only God can give us. And that's not just an intellectual matter. Invariably, the Holocaust is going to broach that issue too.
Okay, so I'll take moderator's privilege and insert a few other ideas into this. First of all, I not only respect but appreciate and agree with just about everything that's been said. So I'm not in any way doing anything other than stepping back and looking at it from a different perspective, perhaps. The angle that I would look at would be one that says, if there is a God, we rightly grieve and in the midst of being appalled and even humiliated over the Holocaust. If there is a God, if the Judeo-Christian God is real, as written about in Scripture, then rightfully we challenge, where were you? What's going on here? This is absolutely horrible, and we weep. If, however, there is no God, then we have no business being upset over the Holocaust. Because I do think that the neighbors in Germany who went along with this had been steeped in the thought systems of their day. And the thought systems of their day was that there is a zero-sum game of resources in this world. We have a finite bucket of food, of energy, and opportunity. So who's going to feed out of that bucket? Thomas Malthus had argued in the 1800s that if you let the inferior feed at the bucket, the inferior will breed, and the scarcity of food will grow even worse, and 10 people will die in the future for every life you save now. So if you want to be a humanitarian, let them die of starvation. And you'll be saving the lives of 9 people in the future. If Nietzsche was right that there's going to be an Übermensch, that there's going to be some superhuman one day as humanity evolves into what we will become, so that in the future they look back at us the way we look back at chimpanzees. We have zero trouble using a chimpanzee to help us find a drug to save lives. If that is true, then why can't we take the genetic inferiors and use them and run medical experiments on them and go ahead and use that finite resource in the bucket of food and opportunities and education, use that to propagate the genetic superiors? Now, if there is no God, we've got no right to grieve over the Holocaust as an inherent moral evil. That's my suggestion. All right, we've got 13 minutes. It's time for the lightning round. Are you all ready? Oh, do you have something to add to this, Jonathan? Please do.
Possible sense of morality, who is unable to be horrified by human injustice, has no concept of justice or goodness. And I think that is fundamentally not true when you look at the way that people act, because you also have to consider that some of the people who in Germany sat by and watched, or even enabled, were believers in God, who believed that they were bringing about God's divine order, who believed that God had decreed bad things for the Jewish people on the grounds of things that they had read in the New Testament and things that had come through years of very specifically Christian ideology coming out of Germany and out of the Reformation. And to reduce that entire thing to only by believing in God can we have any sense of decency or justice or morality or treatment of humanity, and especially only by reading the Bible can we come up with these things, because there's a lot in the Bible about annihilating the outsiders in the name of God's order as well. And it's just more of the same of this, of taking what we think God's order is and that it's the right way to be, that what we've decided is right, we're on God's side. Everybody else is this kind of weird, horrible, kind of monstrous outsider that we need to convert or get rid of because they're dangerous, because they don't have this moral sense that we do. They don't know what order looks like. We need to either convert them or get them out of the way. And I think that approach itself is actually as much of the problem that creates evil as any kind of solution that it could provide in its conception of God's order could be.
So my rejoinder to that would be that I would urge you to listen carefully to my terms, because I didn't say that people who don't believe in God are not able to lament the horrors. I do think they are. They're hardwired for morality. They know right and wrong, whether they admit it or not. What I said is they have no right, based upon their presuppositions of what the world is like. If we are not made in the image of God, if we are just sacks of chemicals along the evolutionary time scale. I mean, we can lament the Holocaust, but we don't lament how many tunas were eaten today by sharks in the Gulf of Mexico. And I assure you, millions of tunas are eaten every year by sharks. They're conscious beings. I mean, we know tunas have feelings in the sense that they've done experiments that show they know what pain is and they try to swim from pain. I'm not saying that people who don't believe in God aren't able to cry over the Holocaust. They are. And they know it's horrible. And they know it's wrong. And they know it's evil because they're hardwired that way. But I'm saying if you follow a logician's logic and you set out in propositional form the presuppositions of reality in a naturalistic atmosphere, the only shot of deriving an imposing view of morality is one that argues, and this is the current state of epistemology on this, one that argues that it's just inherent in the universe's order, that in the fabric of the universe there is a moral code that as of now says that's wrong to do. And you can go back to Euthyphro, and you can go back to the same arguments that Socrates put as recorded by Plato in Euthyphro's dialogue on the way to the court system. And those arguments still unfold the same way. But I'm speaking with a philosopher on my left hand, so I have no right to do it. David?
First, Jonathan, thanks for that. But I do think that distinction is key between God and belief in God. I don't think Mark was saying it's about believing in God. It's about, in a theistic world, our moral intuitions hook up to reality. And then the question, of course, is, okay, given this moral evidence, this phenomenology, the logic, the language of morality, our intuitions about the Holocaust, evidentially, where does that point? And I think you can make a very strong case that it points to theism. Your last point, though, I don't know about that one. It's just that I'm writing a book on moral realism right now, and there's a plethora of secular theories out there. You mentioned Platonism, basically, which is one of them, which I actually think is the second best ethical theory after theism. But you have you have a variety of secular realists, and you've got expressivists and constructivists and error theorists. They give up the ghost on ethics, think it's all false. All that to say, it's a very complicated picture. So when that book comes out, let's all be sure to buy a copy.
That's fair. Well, I interact with a lot of people on this stuff. Some of the moralists who debate this are actually lawyers. So you've got Thomas Nagel and people like that. Nagel's at NYU's law school and others. And it is a fascinating, rich subject area and worthy of engaging. But I will be quick to say that I do believe we're all hardwired for morality. And we can distort it, and our wires can get crossed, and we can corrupt our programming. But inherent within us naturally is an understanding of Tov and Ra. So we've got 5 minutes for the lightning round, and which may just be one question, but I want to shoot one question by you. Okay, we'll start with you, Jonathan. Is there true in the world today? Are there people that are truly, malevolently, purposefully evil?
Yes.
Yes. Lightning round. Ingrid?
Yes.
Yes. John?
Yes, I agree.
They don't start out that way.
Right.
Right. But they can get there.
They can get there, yeah.
All right. Lightning round number 2. And you can say no comment if you don't want to take a position. Is there a real being who seeks to destroy God's order and create his own version of order, aka Satan, the devil.
No.
Yes.
Qualified.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's not God's equal and opposite, of course. It's a dependent being.
Oh, no question about
Yeah.
that. No. This is a deficient.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. The last 2 minutes, Ingrid, without giving away the ghost, would you give us a feel for what tomorrow night's lecture is going to be?
Yeah. Tomorrow we will talk about defining good, defining evil. That certainly is part of the conversation. And the goal is looking at what are the different places, the agents, the sources that evil comes from. Most people are afraid to talk about evil. They don't want to think about it, so it tends to blindside them. Most people are, pretty much everybody has experienced some degree of trauma, and we all have areas in our life that where we remain paralyzed, and frequently we may not even be aware of it. So my goal in tomorrow also is to take evil apart and look at what are some of the sources, what are some of the areas through which evil can enter our lives. And the goal is also to thereby empower us, help us to think about it, reflect on where the evil has come from in our lives, what is our role, what are some of the things that we can do, and then also where is God in the midst of it? What is our response when evil has devastated? It doesn't, because in my life, through the things that I have been through, I came to the conclusion that evil was not going to take me out or those around me, anybody that I could help. And so that was a place that I had to come to after being paralyzed and feeling run over, backed up by fear and by fear of evil. So that's just a short snippet.
Okay, can you join me in saying thank you to these folks?